in a leadership training series entitled Leading Change. This is session number 2. In session 1 we talked about creating a culture of change, and now in this session we're going to talk about communicating for change. If you create a culture of change in the church, you do so by communicating shared values and beliefs. One of the ways that you create that culture of change is you do so by communicating shared values and beliefs. And I want to take and talk about 7 things that leaders communicate that help to facilitate the change process. Number 1, you have to communicate who is going to be involved in the change. Who's going to be affected in the changes that you want to make. And when you do this, you have to consider who are the E.F. Huttons in your church. Who are the people in your congregation that when they talk, other people listen? And you've got to identify those, and you've got to respect their influence, and somehow in this communication process, you've got to enlist them as part of the process. And so you have to communicate to those people that are going to be involved in the change process. What I've discovered as a pastor and as a leader is that strife is usually a communication problem, not a people problem. Strife is usually a communication problem, not a people problem. When you don't communicate clearly, especially to those people that are going to be involved in the change process, what you're trying to accomplish and all those kinds of things we're going to talk about in a minute, then what happens is that lack of communication is going to cause problems. And so as a leader, when I have a breakdown in the process of what I want to accomplish, I always say, listen, it was a communications problem, and every communications problem is the leader's responsibility. Every communication issue is a leader's issue. You have to accept the responsibility to say, I didn't communicate well. Let me find a way to say this better. And the first group you've got to start doing that with is the people who are going to be directly involved and affected by whatever change that you're going to make. If you're making a change in your Christian education, if you have a traditional Sunday school model, then you need to make sure those who involve that ministry are part of communicating to them about this change process. If you're going to make a change in your worship and music area, you got to make sure the folks involved in that are communicated to, because you've got to enlist them if you're going to make this change without conflict, and you're going to have the transition without trouble. But the second thing you've got to communicate is, where are we going? And when you communicate where you're going, that's where you state what your objectives and what your goals are. Here's what we want to accomplish by the changes that we're making. Now, the reason this is important, because this is where you tell the people, as the leader, I know where we're going. Here's where we're going. If they don't have confidence that you know where you're going, they're not going to go with you. They're not going to follow with you. And you can't persuade them to come with you in this journey of change if they don't believe that you know where you're going. And so you have to, as a leader, you have to say, here's what we're trying to accomplish. And if you can't communicate that clearly, then you need to go back and think some more about what you're fixing to do. If you don't know where you're going, nobody's going to follow. And you know Maxwell again, I quote him a lot. He says, if you think you're leading and nobody's following, you're just out for a walk. You know, we've heard for a long time that leadership is lonely. Well, that's not true. If you're leading people, it's not lonely, because they're walking the journey with you. If you're lonely in your leadership, it's because you've not got anybody taking the journey with you. And one of the key reasons for that is you may not have communicated clearly where you're going and what you want to accomplish. But then there's a third thing. You have to communicate, why are we making the change that we're making? Why are we doing what we're going to do? Now this is real simple, but it's hugely important. Nothing discourages a church more than not knowing why they're making the change that they make. They have to know why. What's the reason we're doing this? And when you communicate the why, you have to do, because we're talking about church ministry. Now, we're not talking about just leading an organization or leading a business. We're talking about church ministry. Here's one of the things that has to genuinely be a part of the communication process. You have to make part of the motivation of why you're changing scriptural and biblical. They have to believe, unlike a business, unlike any other organization, because as a church, they have to believe somehow this change is necessary to accomplish what God has called us to do. And the only person that can communicate that is the leader. The man of God who's speaking for the Lord to that body has to be able to create a sense of spiritual destiny in that congregation. Just something as simple as saying, listen, you're here because you love this church. And part of the reason you love this church is you've seen God use this church to impact your own life and the lives of others. And matter of fact, you may have to talk about that a long time to help them again to regain the sense of the spiritual context of ministry. Because, now this is going to be harsh, but the truth is, the reason church becomes more social than it is spiritual is people lose sight of what God has done, is doing, and can do. When they lose sight of God and the spiritual dynamic of what happens as a corporate body called the church, then it moves, and it moves so subtly that you don't even know it until after it happens. And here's one way you know it happens. They're not concerned about winning people anymore. They're not even concerned really about having a good service anymore. They just want to feel good that as a believer, I came to church and I sung the song and I heard the preacher preach and I gave in the offering and I'm okay till next week. Now that sounds kind of harsh, but the truth is that's probably a magnified version of it. But when they lose that sense of God in the process of the change of a church, you're going to have trouble. Because even carnal people think they're spiritual. That's why sometimes they're the most difficult to get along with. They're not mean people. They genuinely have a sense of, this is a God thing for me. And so what you've got to do as a leader when you talk about change is you got to say the reason we're changing, and in that process, it's not all only God. It's not only spiritual. But they have to believe that there's some kind of spiritual motivation behind what you're doing. And so you get them to, listen, you get them to thinking again about the church as a place where God has moved and shown up and He has used that ministry. And you talk about their own sense. Listen, the reason you're here is because God touched your life here. The reason you're here is because it was here that your children were saved. And let's think back for a moment and talk. Let's consider what God's done over the years. And you help them to revisit that spiritual connection. Listen, and sometimes you have to spend a long time talking about God in the past before you can get them to see God in the present. And certainly they've got to see God in the present before they'll believe you can take them where God's going to be in the future. If they don't think that you're spiritual and recognize God in the present, they're not going to follow you into the future. And so in this communication of why you're making this change. Now it's not all spiritual, but they've got to have a spiritual dynamic. It may be as simple as saying, hey folks, God's hand's on this church. Now let me tell you one way you can understand what the ministry calling of a church is sometimes. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. Their history is an indication of their calling to ministry. Look back at the history of that church and you see what God has blessed and what God has grown in the history of that church, and you get some idea of what the calling of that ministry is. Because all of us are called to make disciples, but there's some unique things that every church can do better than they can do other things. The last church I pastored, when we look back over the history of that church, and it was one of the oldest churches in the Church of God, not just in Florida, but in the denomination, They were, I think, 85 years old while I was there. And we began to look back at the history of that church, and we began to see out of that church there were scores, almost 24 people over the life of that church that had been called into vocational ministry. We began to identify some things, and so here's what we began to understand about the calling of God on that church. It would always involve a ministry development component. That'd always be a part. And so we developed what we called a ministry development program there, our own local church ministry development program. We actually had a process where we took people who had a call of God, we paid for them to go to school to get the education, and we provided them an on-site practical work environment where they could practice what they've learned. And out of that experience of that program, there are people who are involved in vocational ministry today. Well, that wasn't a hard sell for me as a leader or a pastor when they understood that was the kind of thing that characterized the ministry of that church historically. And so sometimes the way you do that is you help them to revisit their past and see where God's worked. And if you can bring their past into their present, and then the past doesn't become an obstacle, it becomes a fuel to move them forward. Now here's why this is important. If the vision for change is unclear, the morale will be low. If the vision for change is unclear, the morale will be low. Now the other side of that is true as well. When the vision for change is communicated properly, it creates motivation. And motivation is key to momentum. Motivation is the first part of the process that brings you momentum. But when you communicate correctly why we're making this change, and remember, you got to make part of it spiritual, and it's got to be authentic. It can't be something that's just tagged on. It's got to be real, okay? Because it is ministry, and that's where the Holy Spirit's going to take what you say and speak to their spirit. Now, I know it's not all spiritual, but folks, when we start operating the church purely like a business, we make no room for the Holy Spirit. And if we're trying to accomplish spiritual goals, we have to make room for the Holy Spirit. All right? You have to communicate why you're changing. Number 4, you have to communicate what it will feel like when you get there, wherever there is. Now, here's why that's important. When people know what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it and what it's going to feel like to get where you're going, then the journey becomes something they enjoy. Now this is a strange word when you talk about church and you talk about change and you talk about the whole process. Right here, when you talk about what's it going to feel like to get there, this is where it becomes fun. Now I know that seems odd, but if they don't enjoy the journey, they're not going to make the journey. Now I know I grew up in a very classical, traditional, very conservative Pentecostal environment that if it was F-U-N, it was S-I-N, and so sometimes we don't think about that context, but the truth is, in a leadership context, people have to enjoy the journey or they won't make it with you. And so what you've got to do is you've got to communicate to them, hey folks, this is going to feel great to be a part of. And to make no mistake about it, even though we're people of faith and even though we're spiritual people, we're human enough that we want to feel good about what we're doing in the kingdom. So you create that great feeling of being involved in something significant. And here's why this is important. People are looking for something significant to be a part of. People are looking for something significant to be part of. I'm going to digress here and give you a mini sermon outline. You can live life on 3 levels. The survival level, just enough to get by. Well, that's no fun. You can live life on the success level. The problem with that is not nearly fulfilling after you reach that level of success as you thought it was going to be. That's why some of the most successful people you know are the most miserable people you know. But then you come to that 3rd level, and this is what God created us in His image for. This is what finding your place in the kingdom, doing your calling, this is what happens here. You move not just survival and not just success, but you come to a place of significance. What I'm doing is important. What I'm doing has value. Now, here's why this is important. When you think that what you're doing has value, it makes you feel valuable yourself. And so, as a leader, you've got to communicate this. When you communicate to the people you're leading that what they're doing is a part of the kingdom of God, and they're investing their life, and it's going to be fun, and it's going to be fulfilling, here's what it does. The Holy Spirit uses that to create a desire within them to want to be involved. Now, you don't even have to be a great recruiter if you're a great communicator, because the communication, the Holy Spirit uses that in a context of ministry to stir them to want to get involved. Now you say, Bishop, that sounds awful spiritual. It is spiritual. But the motivation for ministry has to have a spiritual dynamic. But at the same time, because we're human, we've got to say to folks, this is going to be fun, this is going to be fulfilling, and this is going to be something that has great lasting value. It's significant. It really is important. And I remember when I went to my last church, and I didn't really understand this principle, but kind of intuitively, I remember 20-something years later what I said the first Sunday at the last church I pastored. And at that church, I don't mean this to be arrogant, but I want to make a point of something. I've never pastored a church that didn't grow. Now, some grew more than others, but it's only the last church that I pastored that I understand why it grew, and because I had an understanding, it was able to grow faster because I was able to facilitate that. And so this last place I went, the first Sunday there, 20 years ago, I can still remember what I said. I stood before the congregation my first Sunday and I said, I don't know all that God's going to do, but I do know God, and it's going to be good. I said that, didn't think a thing about it. It connected with their spirit, because see, here's what I did. I talked about God, and I talked about what's going to happen with them and us and God as we come together in partnership. Now, unbeknownst to me, that phrase, it's going to be good, that I used on the first Sunday, become a phrase that marked the first several years of my ministry. Now, this may sound simplistic and funny, but you got to remember this is 20 years ago. Without any prompting from me, leaders in that church went and had caps made, ball caps made, and had on there, it's going to be good. They had buttons made. And I didn't even really know what I'd said, but I look back now, I know what I was doing. I was saying, here's how it's going to feel if you'll begin this journey with me. And that's crucial in this process. All right, number 5. You got to communicate what they can do. What they can do. In other words, how every individual can have a part in this ministry, in the change process. And what you do as a leader, if you're a good leader, you have the ability to help people to see how their individual part fits into the whole. It gives them a sense of value to their individual effort. Now I'm going to kind of add something here, maybe a little bit of a digression, but it ties in. And I want to talk about something that's real simple but real important. Actually, 2 things. Number 1 is the difference between a manager and a leader is a manager tells you what to do, a leader tells you why he wants you to do it. It takes more time, but the why is what gives value to the what. Now here's where you move from being a boss to a leader. A boss says, I want you to do this and get it done. A leader says, I want you to do this, but here's why. The leader takes the extra time to tell them why, but in doing that, then what they do has more value. It's not just a job, it's something that is significant. Now, we're taping this today, and I hope I don't mess up the process with what I'm fixing to do. I'm going to ask Brother David Hagee to come up here and join me for a minute. I want to show you another simple principle. And this is so simple, but it's huge. It's very, very powerful. As a leader, You want people to feel good, but you also want them to feel valuable. And what we're talking about here is you communicate what they can do. This is where you give them a sense of personal value. Let's say Brother David has helped me to do something I've been working on in my ministry. If I tell him privately, thanks for your help, it makes him feel good. But when I tell him publicly, hey, I just want to let y'all know that Brother David has been such a help in this process of what we're doing. Now, he felt good when I did that privately, but he feels valuable when I do that publicly. All right? It's a simple thing, but it is crucial. In private, they feel good. In public, they feel valuable. And you've got to find a way that you communicate their individual role that makes them feel valuable in the part of the change that you're trying to facilitate. All right, number 6. You've got to communicate how you're going to make the change that you're making. How you're going to make the change that you're making. Now, this is where you start talking about specific strategy. This is where that you begin to communicate so that they'll cooperate with you. This is crucial to having not just participation, but cooperation. They're doing it not because they have to, but because they want to. Sometimes people participate because they have to. But they participate because they want to when you've communicated a way that they're saying, I want to cooperate because I want to see the end result to happen. Lack of cooperation is always a communication issue. Lack of cooperation is always a communication issue. And you've got to be secure enough as a leader, because the truth is you're human on your best day. There may be times as a leader that you don't communicate as well as you should as others. And you've got to be secure enough to say, look, that's a failure on my part. I didn't communicate this right to you. I didn't tell you like I should have. And here's what that'll do. When you're honest about that, that'll give you a second opportunity to communicate. When you're not honest about that, you're not going to get that second opportunity. So if you can't, and I wish I could tell you every time I've communicated as in administrative ministry or as a pastor that I did it right the first time, I wished I could tell you that. And the key to that especially is if you've got staff, whether it's paid staff or volunteer staff. And it's more important with volunteer staff because they don't have to do what they're doing it. They're doing it voluntarily. Now, if you're paying a guy, he can participate and not really cooperate. But with a volunteer, he don't have to participate. So you need him to do it because he wants to. And if there's ever a time that you need to communicate, it's with that group. With everybody especially, but with that group. And if you mess up, if you don't do a good job, then confess. If you'll be honest about that, you'll get a second chance to communicate. If you refuse to acknowledge the communication issue as a leader, you won't get a second chance. Now, I know that sounds kind of hard, but that's just the reality. Because when you talk about ministry, we're in the people business. And whether they're saved or unsaved, people are people at some level. All right, now here's what happens. When you communicate in a way that gets them to cooperate with you, that gets everybody moving in the same direction. Everybody's going in the same direction. And when you communicate vision properly, it promotes unity. And communicating properly is important or imperative if you're going to have unity. Now, what I'm fixing to say, these next few moments are probably some of the most important things I'm going to say in this whole entire session. When you go through a change and you talk about communicating for change, you talk about this culture of change, here's some things, 3 things that are inevitable to happen. All right? There are going to be you're going to eliminate some things. You're going to have to explain some things. And you're going to have to emphasize some things. I promise you, you may not have thought about it in that terminology, but I promise you that if you have communicated clearly about what your strategy is and how you're going to do this, then you've had to at least think through, all right, in order to accomplish this change, here's our strategy, and it's going to involve eliminating some things. Some things that we're not going to do anymore. Why? Because our strategy is this, if we're going to accomplish our goal. There's some things you're going to have to explain. Here's why we're doing what we're doing. There's some things that you're going to have to emphasize. All right? This is why we're doing this, and really hit it. Now, I'm going to digress here another moment and just tell you something else. When you go through this process, there's some things that need to die in your church. That doesn't mean you don't have to kill everything that needs to die. I won't say that again. You don't, as the pastor, as a leader, you don't have to kill everything that needs to die. Some things you kill just by ignoring it. Now, you do have to be wise enough to know what you can ignore. I remember, and I won't tell you specifically because I'm not sure where this tape session is going to end up entirely, but in the last church I was at, there was a certain ministry in the church that they were just a challenge from day one. And I realized at some point in the process that I didn't have to fight them over it. I just ignored them. I didn't give them any of my time. I didn't give them any of my energy. I didn't give them any of my resources. And here's what happened. It died its own death, and I didn't have to kill it. Now, you can't do everything that way, but the truth is there are some things you can do that way. All right, let me move on. Number 7. You have to communicate what the rewards will be. And here's the truth. Increase commitment by communicating the benefit of change. Whatever you want people to be more committed to, you've got to communicate the benefit of. You've got to say, all right, here's the payoff if you pay this price. And if you can convince them the payoff is worth the price, they're going to partner with you in doing that. If they're convinced that the payoff is worth the price in the context of change, they're going to partner with you in doing that. And we talk about communicating what the rewards will be. Again, they've got to feel good about it. It's got to be something that stirs them on a feeling level, but it also has to be something that has a spiritual component to it. You know, it's this whole principle of we all want to hear God say one day to us, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." So you've got to communicate both of those things to it. And when you talk about communicating this, communication is not just verbal. A picture is worth 1,000 words. All right? Now this session is going to be a little bit longer than the previous session because we're going to cover so much more material. The fastest way to create a culture of change and to communicate for change is to get your church and leaders to be receptive to change, is to expose your key leaders to model churches. Now why is this important? Because everybody learns primarily by 3 ways. We learn through formal education, we learn by experience, and we learn by example. But we learn the best by example. Because people, especially in our culture, are visually oriented, and it's better to see than just to hear. That means this. Have you noticed that when we see the advertisement for conferences nowadays, they're not pastors' conferences, they're just ministry conferences? Because we're understanding that when you have a conference to train and educate people as leaders, then what you need is more than the pastor going to a conference and coming back and trying to tell the whole church. You take the other leaders with you, and so you have people who can come in and help you to share what they learn, and they can communicate some of the excitement, and it doesn't all just fall on you. And the truth is, if you're going to accomplish change of any kind, especially significant change, you're not going to be able to do it by yourself. So I would never go to a conference by myself. You need to go and grow together. That doesn't mean everybody has to be involved, but you may need to be strategic about who you include. It's a huge mistake to come back from a conference and try to initiate these new ideas, this change, by simply saying this, look, here's what we're going to do. You fall back into that manager role and you cease to be a leader. You can't just tell people, hey, I went to this conference, I saw this, it's good, I believe it'll work, we're going to do it. You can't do that. You fall back into a manager role and you cease to be a leader. And so I want to encourage you to help people, get people alongside you who can share the responsibility. Because the truth is, as a pastor, you're the leader of the leaders, but you can't be the only leader. It takes strong leaders to build a strong church. If you're the only leader, you got a church full of followers. Now, I hate to say this, but I'm going to put it in real simple terms, and a church that only has followers will eventually fail. Amen. It may not fail in a day, it may not fail in a week, it may not fail in a month, but I promise you, the life cycle of a church that has only one leader is not long. And so what you have to do as a leader is you have to raise up leaders, and you're the leader of the leaders. And you have to be secure enough as the leader that you can say to folks, hey, let's go. Now, taking them to the conference is not the only way to expose them to new models. Here's some other simple things you can do, and most of these are common sense things. You can expose your leaders to new ideas and change through books, through CDs, through church visits, by telling them about webinars and letting them participate in those. I'll tell you one of the funniest things that happened to me in my last church. There was a man that was on our board, and he was a great guy, and but he was an older gentleman, and I was getting our board to read a particular book. As a pastor, you have basically 3 responsibilities. Now, I know it's broad in this, but just bring it down into the 3 simple responsibilities. Number 1, you are the one that gives direction to the church. Number 2, you need to be the chief declarer of the truth. If you're not the primary theologian in your church, you're going to have a problem. Amen. All right, but number 3 is you have got to develop other leaders. And so I've always done this in my ministry. As an administrator, as a pastor, I'm the leader of the leaders. And my ministry success will be directly related to the leadership growth of those who are the closest to me. And so I always have had that principle of developing leaders. And so I have this church board, and I give them this book I want them to read. And he wasn't a bad man. He was a good man. He said, Pastor, he said, don't you think the Bible's enough? And in a moment of inspiration, I said, doesn't your wife teach a Sunday school class? Yeah. I said, does she use anything besides the Bible to prepare for that? And he said, well, yeah, sure she does. And I said, why? Doesn't she think the Bible's enough? He said, she uses commentaries to help explain what she's teaching. And I said to him, think of this book as a commentary on ministry. He was the first one to read it, and the truth is, not only did they have to read it, but they had assignments. The church board had assignments. And he was the first one to turn his assignment in. Now here's why I said all that. There's all kind of ways to expose your leaders to change and things that will help them to grow. And here's the truth. You've heard John Maxwell say this, that when you stop growing, your ministry stops growing. Now, we don't like to hear that. I don't like to hear that. But it's the truth. And so you can't just come back from a conference and say, here's what I learned, we're going to do this. You've got to always stay in that leadership role as a pastor if you want to be leading a ministry. Now, you can do that if you just want to have a motion of services and things, activities. But if you want to be in a leadership ministry as leading, you've got to be a leader. All right. Here's what these examples do. These examples answer the how question. Rather than just tell the church what needs to be changed, you give them examples. You show the leaders, you show the church the benefits of change. And here's one of the last statements that we're going to say in this session. This is huge. When they see the benefits of change, it decreases the battle for change. When they see the benefits for change, it decreases the battle for change. All right? In session 1, we talked about creating a culture of change. In this session, we talked about communicating for change. And in the final session, we're going to talk about celebrating the progress of change. Thanks.